right, so we're recording now about gross domestic product, or GDP. First, let me tell you, when I was growing up in high school, the way that they measured it was not GDP, gross domestic product, it was GNP, gross national product. And in the 70s, that included monies that American companies made from overseas affiliates and would repatriate it back to America, and that's what they counted as gross national product, included all national entities. But in the 80s, they started tweaking that, and they came up with a better formula for it, and it's called gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product tells us whether or not we're growing. Okay, we want to be growing all the time. We're hungry hippos here. We want to be growing all the time. We want to control our growth. I mean, obviously, you know, if you go to college, they talk about the freshman 15. Well, you know, the freshman 15, if you're going away to college, unlike, you know, what might happen this year, you're going away to college and your behavioral changes, your patterns change. You just go, you know, you're eating at all times of the day. You got snacks everywhere. You're not eating healthy. But we do want to grow. Okay, we do want to grow and grow up, grow out, you know, grow stronger, grow healthier. And any change in that, any stagnation or a slide backwards, that's either recession or depression land. Remember, recession is defined as 6 to 18 months or 2 to 6 quarters of stagnant or recessed growth. Anything over 18 months or 6 quarters is considered a depression. So we want to see growth. We want to see it be real, meaning that it's inflation adjusted. So we're going to have to talk about price indexes. We'll get to that a little bit later on in chapter 6. So we'll kind of work that into the equation here. But right now we're just going to talk about GDP. We want to talk about GDP. If the post-it number is, the way they calculate GDP is if you could calculate everything that goes on in our country, is to take a price value and multiply it by an output value and come up with a number that is what is called the nominal GDP. Nominal is just the raw numbers. This is what we value all of our output at, and this is how many units of output we did in a calendar year or in a quarter, and therefore it's nominal GDP. When we take out inflation, that becomes real GDP, and that's what we put on the x-axis. The x-axis of our standard ASAD graph is real GDP. All right, so now GDP. You can play along. You could write this down. You could access the PowerPoint, whatever you want to do. I'll show you again. We'll go back to the base formula, and then we'll kind of break out what does not count here. All right. So let me share screen. All right. So I'm going to share the screen here. And we'll talk about gross domestic product here. Now, this is what's referred to as the aggregate expenditures model. There is a second model. I'll deal with that in the video part two of this lesson. It is not, and actually there's a third one I've got to go through. So I'll save those two for the second video. But this one is going to focus on gross domestic product and the aggregate expenditure model. It is what is now commonly used majority of the time. I think I have maybe seen one multiple choice question on the other versions of the GDP formula, and it was more of a kind of a quick topical question rather than a calculation question. So this model is what we tend to use most often in our look at macroeconomy here. All right, gross domestic product, GDP. Remember, again, we've talked about C component is consumption. That's basically what we demand on a daily basis, with small businesses demand in terms of average stuff. We're not talking about big ticket stuff that comes in the I sub G, but consumption. And most of our economy is geared, 70% of it, over $14 trillion worth of our economy's production is geared toward consumption. Now remember, this is not sales, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but this is the output, and we want, you know, to be perfectly balanced. You want the output of an economy and the income to be exactly the same, so that the income purchases all the output of the economy. There's no surplus, there's no leftovers. Remember, leftovers or surplus or shortages are inefficient. We want to be efficient. So consumption, 70%. Now, government at all levels here is a player in this to the tune of perhaps $3 to $3.5 trillion. Now, remember, government isn't going to be able to provide the same kind of things that the private sector markets could, but it does provide services. It does provide, for example, for people who have no health insurance, Medicaid, it gets access to doctors, government health clinics, kind of things. So government does provide some goods and services, and it is a player in this market. So they do output some stuff here for us. I sub G, business investment. This is gross private investment. This is upgrades, updates, software, hardware, technology, floor space, construction, anything that is there to improve business. And again, this one, of all the components here, that I sub G one is the one that goes the most crazy, because it is by its very nature volatile. If you look at the kind of run up we had up until 9/11, or not 9/11, 2000, the Y2K, there was a huge surge. People were panicked when it came to like 1998, 1999. They were really upset. They thought that literally their computer, because it's set for 2 zeros, and maybe the computer doesn't understand that it's 1998 going to 99 to 2000, maybe it would reset back to 1900 and cause some kind of computer loop and destroy the computer systems. So there was a lot of investment in technology, in the hardware, the infrastructure, as well as the software. And all of a sudden, after 2000, when it didn't crash, it didn't collapse, didn't cause chaos and panic, there was no technology. Basically, technology stocks went in the year 2000. In the early quarter, and that first quarter was so bad that the tech stock bubble burst, and we talked about that in the big PowerPoint. Tech stock bubble burst in March of 2000 because there was literally nobody buying tech. Everybody had upgraded. Everybody had done all their checks, their balances, their firewalls, their security systems, upgraded the software, the hardware, the backbones, everything. They didn't need it. And then you have the kind of pressure valve. We talked about that in chapter 5, the pressure valve being trade X minus M, or net X. All right, and again, this is the aggregate expansion model. So, all right, so now we're going to get into the what does and what does not count. And you've got to be really clear about this. There's going to be an assignment coming up after this where you're going to play around with the idea of government stimulus, trying to kick GDP forward, kick it rightward on our ASAD graph, kick aggregate demand out, and get going. But you're going to see the limitations here with that. So here we go. All right. Oops. All right. So that didn't work well. All right. Somehow that didn't work. Okay. What does count? What doesn't count? Well, here we go. On the first side here, final goods. Final goods means everything that rolls off the assembly line. Okay, as it is, that product that's in a package, that is the final good. It comes out and it's designed to be consumed somewhere. Okay, final good. Okay, final good. Not intermediate goods. Okay, intermediate goods or parts don't count. So think about this for a second. You are a company. You own a company that manufactures brake pads for whatever automobile industry, giant you want to talk about. Let's say Toyota, for example. Let's say half of your products, total $15 million, go to a Toyota assembly plant in Princeton, Indiana. And you every year you do that, $15 million worth of parts. Okay, great, wonderful. That $15 million doesn't count toward GDP because those are parts that go into a bigger final good. When that car rolls off the assembly line in Princeton, Indiana, that's the final value. Okay. Now, the other half of the parts you make, let's say the other half of the brake pads you make, go to Pep Boys and automobile garages around the country to be a kind of a replacement part for Toyotas if you ever need to have your brakes redone. That does count, and it will get factored into that service call that you bring when you bring your Toyota in for getting a new brake job. That's going to factor into it because that, the labor, and then there's the parts for it. So that will count because that in the case doesn't go into a final good. It is in and of itself a final good because it is used to replace the parts that are there. Okay, it doesn't add value to that car because the car is already there. But the fact is you are contracting out for repair work You need the part for that. So parts that go into a final good, no. Okay, any part. The shampoo bottle. I keep using shampoo all the time as a consumer good. The shampoo bottle is a plastic part that could be made by some other company, not Procter and Gamble or Colgate-Palmolive or whoever makes Suave or whatever shampoos you want to talk about, Garnier. That doesn't count because it's the final bottle that does count. All right, talk about goods produced in this country. Okay, goods produced in this country. That Toyota, if it rolls off the assembly line in Princeton, Indiana, it's American GDP. The engine could be from Japan. The transmission could be from a company that they source it out in Thailand. But if it's manufactured, put together, and rolls off the assembly line here, it's American GDP. Now, I have a Mitsubishi right now. Probably will turn it in soon because my lease is up soon. But that car was made in a Mitsubishi factory in Normal, Illinois. Now, that factory has since closed down, but that's American GDP. It's got a big sticker on it, Union Made in Illinois, Okay, it's American GDP. I didn't intend it that way. It just happened to be that way. Okay, produced here, not imported here. Okay, so immediately we talk about the exclusion being that it's produced somewhere else. If it is produced somewhere else, that's their GDP, not yours. You didn't produce it. Okay, production. Keep putting that in your mind. Production, production, production. That's what's wrong here. Okay, it's got to be produced at a specific time. So when it rolls out, if that car rolls off the assembly line on December 31st, 2020, it's in 2020's GDP. It may not be sold for another year, but it doesn't matter when it's sold. It's the time that it is produced. So it's on 2020's GDP, not 2021's when it finally gets sold. No, it's where it's produced and when it's produced. Okay, final services. That's another part of this equation. Final goods and services. This is direct to you or direct to the business person. That computer tech person who goes out and upgrades or puts in a firewall or does something to a company's computer network, that counts as GDP because it's a fee for a service. Okay, if they use parts, then the parts to replace parts, then we would talk about that. But services could also be your personal trainer, your personal chef. If you have a chiropractor, if you have you go for physical therapy, that's a service. You have your taxes done, that's a service. There's a lot of things that are services that you might not think about. When you rent a car, that's a service. You rent a hotel room on vacation, that's a service. You are entertained at that amusement park. Well, maybe not this year, but in the past, that is a service. You are being provided that. A lawyer, a doctor, an architect, an engineer, anybody you contract out with to provide a service that you can't do yourself. You have lawn care people come by and take care of your house. That's a service. You have the guy come on, clean the gutters. That's a service. Rent on an apartment is technically considered a fee for service. Car insurance, health insurance, that is fee for service. So you got to think about it. Fee for service is part of it. Now, there's a kind of weird exception here, and this is where I got into an argument with a couple of teachers in the building years ago when we were talking about this. Stocks. The actual stock doesn't count because it's a transfer of an asset. I didn't put it on this list, but I wanted to tie it into this fee-for-service argument here. The fee-for-service is the commission. If you are paying $4.99, $7.99, $9.99 for a stock trade, that fee for the service of using that company to buy and sell stocks for you does count. The value of your stock transaction does not count because it doesn't do anything. You are taking a piece of paper, literally sometimes a piece of paper, when it was back in the day when you had stock shares that were literal shares, and transferring it from you to me, boom, or me to you. That doesn't produce anything. It is transfer of ownership of an asset. It doesn't produce anything. So when we talk about the stock market's doing great. The stock market doesn't produce any GDP. Now, if a company does an IPO, an initial public offering, and takes that money and then puts it back into the company by investing in technology or building a new factory, that ends up in GDP as either business investment or consumption. That works. But if they're just taking the money so that they can have it and giving money to their corporate execs, no, it's a transfer of an asset, and that doesn't count. But the stock, the commission, the transaction fees, the commission does count. All right, so that works. Now, you have to worry about this one here because this ties into the last point I said about sales. There are a lot of people employed in this country who sell stuff. Okay, all their job is to do is to ring it up on a cash register. They didn't make it, they didn't package it. They're sales. A Starbucks coffee is GDP because you're going in there and they are making it for you. But if you go into the supermarket and pull something off the shelf and go ring it out, the dollar value of that cash register transaction doesn't count. The GDP might count if it was produced in America this year, but sales itself don't. I know we've got a lot of people, and they have income. They go out and spend that income. They pay taxes. We pay sales tax. All that. Yeah, I got it. But you know what? It doesn't count. Not one damn bit. Okay, especially when you consider what we're selling and what you're buying. Okay, it doesn't count. Straight sales don't count. Okay, next, resales. A resale, used textbook, doesn't count. The original publication date, year of that textbook, is when that GDP would be accounted for, not being resold by a college student who sells it and then you buy it next semester. No, resales don't count. Used movies, used CDs, most of the things on eBay. No, not happening. Doesn't work. Resales don't count. Used car doesn't count. That car can be sold 100 different times. Doesn't count. Okay, doesn't. Because there's no new output generated by that. It's a transfer of an asset in this case. That car is an asset to you or to other people. They sold it to get money. You buy it because you need it for work or for college or for life, and it's an asset to you. It's not just something you're going to consume and throw away. Now, the PowerPoint stuck there on chores and household work. The value of what you do around the house doesn't count at all. It is not. It is part of just the expectation of being a homeowner or being a person living in a house that you have to do your own laundry. You want to contract out with that? You want to contract out with yard service or lawn services? Fine, that is GDP, but you're paying for it. But things that you do on your own, no, not one bit. All right, your mom cooks a meal, your dad does the maintenance work, doesn't count. Does not count. Chores, household work does not count. No, yeah, and there are the studies that say, well, this is a very important thing, that the parent who stays at home and cooks the meals and cleans, does everything else, is worth X amount of dollars. Yeah, okay, great, but that's not GDP. We don't count it as GDP, and it doesn't count as GDP. Now, there's one other bullet point that I forgot to put on here, and I think it goes without saying, that illegal activities don't count because we can't measure them. Okay, now obviously a drug dealer who sells drugs and makes a lot of money goes and buys a brand new car. That car was produced. Yeah, it does kind of recirculate back into the whole circular flow argument here. Does work, but the actual sale of the drugs or the production of illegal activities does not count. So informal activities like you shoveling your own sidewalk after a snowstorm doesn't count. And the illegal activities that concern drug trafficking or other vices does not count. Okay. Even though they're maybe manufacturing drugs, the production doesn't count here. So, and that underground economy, between those two things, the illegal and the informal, the underground economy in certain countries is dramatic. The more civilized, the more upright standing an economy is, the less you will have underground. Now, there's always going to be underground. I'm driving around, Milltown Road today, and I'm seeing people with yard sales. Well, again, sales, not happening, doesn't count, but that's generating income, and it's informal, and yeah, if the government really wanted to be nasty, they could tax people for it. eBay could get that way. If you sell more than $20,000 worth of eBay stuff, yeah, per year, they do tend to pass that info on to the IRS. But this is not happening as much as you think. Now in America, it's maybe about 10%. So if our economy is humming at about $20 trillion, there is probably about $2 trillion worth of this underground or illegal stuff going on. But that money does, again, recirculates back in, and so we tend not to focus on it. But you look at a country's case like Greece, and there was a teacher who taught physics in our school, and he was from Greece, and he traveled back to Greece every once in a while. He had relatives there, and he says it's the most unproductive country in the world. Everything's done under the table. The government has no tax collection authority because, people go around putting in swimming pools and they don't register anything. They're not licensed. They just do it, and they're collecting cash, so it's a discounted price. And they lose track of what they actually do produce, and they lose track of the tax dollars because of that too. So again, the informal and the illegal activities don't count. All right, so kind of pause this one and just kind of look at this slide and get into it, because there are going to be questions that come out on these tests where they're going to ask you to discern what is and what isn't GDP. And I've seen that on the free response, and I've seen it when it comes to identifying items from a list and then giving you one or two multiple choice questions to chew on based on that kind of GDP related stuff. Okay, so we move from here to debt payments. Debt payments, yeah, well, debt payments don't count. Like that transfer of an asset of stock or of an existing house when you sell and buy, debt payments don't count here either. And that's because they don't produce anything. The interest on the loan is GDP. Remember, that's a fee for a service. You borrow money. Interest is the fee you pay. So you have a fee for service. But the actual debt payment itself, the principal on that, is not. So debt payments, you owe your dad $100. No, it doesn't count because that violates that one, and it violates the household rule. Plus, again, if you're paying off debt, you're not demanding anything. You already demanded that car. Okay, that value of that car is when it's produced. You paying off of it for the next 6 years at 0.5% interest for 72 months for top-tier credit customers, only the interest really counts. So, all right, so let's move on. Service labor. Ooh, this one gets people all the time. You have a bunch of people collaborating on a project. They are researching, in case of right now where we're at the COVID-19 vaccines, all of their time, their effort, all of that brain power that goes in, all of the mechanical labor that goes into setting up these experiments, all of that will eventually produce a vaccine. When it's produced, yes, then the value of it can be assessed. But all of that research and everything that went into it doesn't get counted anywhere because it's going into a final good or service. So the study was done on a new car model, the Ford Taurus, when it debuted, I think in the late 70s or early 80s. And Ford ran it for about 30 years. The Ford Taurus cost $100 million to design and engineer just to get that first production model out there ready to go. $100 million. Now, Ford obviously is going to recoup that, especially over a vehicle that lasted 30 years. They were selling 500,000 of them a year, at one point in time. That'll be recouped, and of course the production of that is GDP. But anything that the kind of collaborative effort here doesn't count. You're working for somebody who's producing a final product. You're designing it. Apple designs their iPhones in America, in Cupertino, in the big circle building, spaceship building. Then they send it over to Foxconn in Taiwan, who then contracts out into China, and they make it in China. It's Chinese GDP. But all that effort going into it doesn't count. Doesn't count. All right, let's move. I'll talk about GDP here. Now, again, this is the aggregate expenditures model. We're going to have to talk about that other one because in that one of those other models, China's actually ahead of us. But that one I'm going to have to explain with a video, with a separate. I'm going to find a video because I think I don't do a good job explaining purchasing power parity. I'll get somebody else to do it for me. But in 2019-ish time period, this is what our economy looked like. $21 trillion worth when you combine all four. Now remember, we're running a trade deficit of about $600 to $700 billion per year. So our number there is actually, we produce about 22 and a half, perhaps as a good year, $1 trillion worth, and that negative trade balance takes that out. China's second. Now you think about where China came from after Mao's death in 1977. China is a third world country at that point in time. So in the 42 years since then, especially under Deng Xiaoping, China has made remarkable progress. Japan was always the second biggest economy in the world since 1970, but got displaced by China. Germany Germany is still the #2 exporter. They export, again, as we talked about, a lot of big ticket items, heavy technology, big technology pieces. And as you can see, there's the 20 top economies in the world. I am not responsible for putting Taiwan province of China on it. This just happens to be the chart that I got from. So somebody there does not want to offend the Chinese, the People's Republic government by calling Taiwan an independent country. But you know, these are in billions of dollars. So even a country like India is top 5. Brazil is close by. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world, 5th most populous country in the world. And if you put together all the European Union countries, they would have a GDP that would be at or around where we are, or a little bit higher perhaps. You know, if you put together all 28 members. But these are the countries. No surprises here, really. You know, you look at countries like Switzerland, they do it by quality, big ticket stuff. Saudi Arabia does it with oil. Russia does it with oil, some consumer goods, but they don't export a lot of that kind of stuff. You have countries that deal a lot with raw materials or agricultural products. Brazil with citrus, #1 citrus exporter in the world. Canada with lumber and oil exports. They produce it, they send it out. Boom. Germany works on manufactured goods. Japan manufactured goods. Japan has no native resources of its own. Manufactures and then produces final goods, sends them out. So there's the economy. Now, again, it's kind of interesting. The United States is roughly, what, 6% of the world's population? 7% of the world's population, 6 to 7%. And we are 1/5 of the world's GDP. So, you know, big countries. India, you know, like I said, India, for being a populous country, doesn't necessarily produce as much value stuff. China does it by pure volume. Okay, they produce a lot of cheap stuff, but they produce a lot of it and send it out. Okay, so that gives you the kind of idea where we're going with comparative GDP numbers. Now you take a look at GDP growth over time since World War II. Here, I could put the historical one up from 1800. That's, you know, kind of silly to do that because you know we're growing. But you look at the post-World War II time period here, with those exceptions of the gray bars, which are the recessions, the economy has been growing steadily. You look at the time Reagan took office in 1981, the economy of the world, the economy of the United States, excuse me, was about, I don't know, about $6 trillion in terms of chained 2005 equivalent. That's when they're taking 2005's value for the dollar. In its own terms, Reagan was dealing with a $3 trillion economy. But if we compare it to 2005 numbers, how do we do that? We play around with price levels, and we can create a deflator, and we can create a price index to match it. But you can just see that there's pretty steady growth, and then took the big hit in 2007, 8, 9 with that Great Recession. And we'll see what the numbers bear out once we get past and through the COVID recession, and, you know, grow back to the way we were. Okay. Again, this is chained $2005. We're measuring $2005. The like I said, 21 million right now. Now, did we grow 7 million? Well, you know, again, chained to $2005. That'll do it there. But in raw numbers, it's $21 trillion. Now, if you look at GDP over a shorter period of time, now you can get to see the kind of skitterishness around a recession. This area at the beginning of the chart was the 2001, 2. You could see that in this first quarter of 2000, you had the tech stock bubble burst, and kind of everybody went after tech, after overdosing on tech. Then we had a really strong second quarter, but it was maybe a sugar rush, and fell back in the third quarter. Fourth quarter bounced back, and then that's that kind of, the kind of craziness of up, down, peak, trough. And then you see the recession coming in 2001, begins officially in March, and then continues till November. But even so, the recovery wasn't a steady kind of slope up. It always, even within a small period of time, acts like a sine wave. It kind of bounces, not necessarily up and down, but just it kind of dipsy doodles its way through there. All right, so this is the end of the of this particular video. So you have the GDP PowerPoint that you can review. You can review this video again. And the important thing here to understand is production in the United States, final good or service, not contributing to, but the final actual value of something that rolls off the assembly line or is the direct service contact here between you and that provider, or business and that provider, and they're the beneficiaries of that final service. So again, types and specifications, you can again reread your textbook on that. All right, any questions on this? Again, the chapter 6776 FAQ page, please post them and I will get back to you. All right, thank you much.